When people talk about classic westerns, two names come up more than any others: John Wayne and Randolph Scott. Both were symbols of a rugged America, tall, stoic men who lived by their own code. They carried guns on screen, faced danger without flinching, and shaped the cowboy myth that defined an era. But behind the scenes, there was a hatred so deep that it outlived them both. For decades, people whispered about it. Hollywood insiders knew something had poisoned what once seemed like friendship. Now, the truth about why Randolph Scott utterly despised John Wayne has finally come to light. If this kind of story touches your heart, if you're someone who cares about truth, responsibility, and speaking up for the voiceless, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with someone who should hear it. Let's get started. In the 1930s, Randolph Scott and John Wayne were climbing the same Hollywood ladder. Scott, a former soldier and Southern gentleman, had an air of refinement, the kind of man who'd hold a door open for a lady even on a dusty movie set. Wayne, on the other hand, was rough-edged, loud, and brash. He was still years away from becoming the Duke, but he already carried himself like he owned every room he walked into. They first met through the cowboy circuit, endless B-movies where they played sheriffs, outlaws, and ranchers. To the studios, they were just two handsome men who looked good on a horse, but to each other, they were rivals. For a time, they actually lived together. The two shared a beach house in Santa Monica with a rotating crowd of Hollywood bachelors. It was a wild place, poker games, whiskey, and women coming and going like waves. Photos from that period show them laughing side by side, sunbathing between shoots, looking like brothers. But under the laughter was something simmering: competition. Both wanted the same thing: to be the ultimate Western star. And there was only room for one. Everything changed in 1939. Director John Ford was preparing a new Western Stagecoach. The role of the Ringo Kid would become one of the most iconic in cinema history. At first, Ford wanted Randolph Scott. Scott had more experience, more gravitas, and in Ford's words, the face of a man who's already seen the end of the world. But John Wayne wanted that role desperately. He needed a hit. His career had been drifting after years of forgettable cowboy flicks. Stagecoach could save him. According to multiple accounts, Wayne lobbied hard, using every favor he could call in. And somehow, miraculously, the role went to him instead of Scott. Stagecoach made John Wayne a star overnight, and for Randolph Scott, it was a wound that never healed. Friends said Scott never spoke of it directly, but everyone around him knew. One producer recalled, he congratulated Wayne in public, but in private he couldn't hide the bitterness. He knew that was his part, the one that got stolen. From that day forward, their friendship was finished. When World War II came, both men faced another test, but not on screen. Randolph Scott, who had once served in the military, immediately supported the troops. He worked tirelessly to raise funds and even volunteered for training assignments. John Wayne, however, did not enlist. He stayed in Hollywood, continuing to make movies while others went off to fight. To many, that was understandable. He had a family to support and studios pressured him to stay. But to Scott, it was unforgivable. He played heroes on screen, one friend said, but when it came time to be one in real life, Randolph thought he ran away. From that moment, Scott's disgust for Wayne turned into something darker: moral contempt. He saw Wayne not just as a rival, but as a hypocrite who had betrayed everything the cowboy ideal stood for. After the war, the tension in Hollywood grew. The Red Scare swept through the industry, and loyalty became a weapon. John Wayne took a public stand against communism, heading the Motion Picture Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals. He believed it was his duty to cleanse Hollywood of subversive elements. Randolph Scott kept quiet. He hated politics in general and thought actors had no business ruining each other's livelihoods. But silence, in those days, could be dangerous. One night, at a dinner party, a screenwriter whispered that Wayne had privately accused Scott of being soft on communism, an absurd claim, but one that carried weight in McCarthy's America. When Scott heard about it, he reportedly slammed his drink down and said, "That man's words are poison. He'll destroy anyone to make himself look like a patriot." It was no longer a feud, it was war. The 1950s should have been Randolph Scott's golden years. He starred in some of the most respected westerns of all time. Ride Lonesome, The Tall T, 7 Men from Now. His films were quieter, more introspective, even poetic. He played men haunted by age, regret, and lost honor. Critics began calling him the thinking man's cowboy. John Wayne, meanwhile, ruled the box office with big, loud pictures like The Searchers and Rio Bravo. He was America's idea of manhood, untouchable, indestructible, the embodiment of the frontier spirit. But behind closed doors, Wayne often mocked Scott's films as boring little art pieces. Scott fired back, saying Wayne's movies were parades of noise and ego. Their feud spilled into studio politics, producers forced to choose between them, directors warned not to praise one in front of the other. One executive famously said, "You can work with Duke, or you can work with Randy. Never both." The feud reached its peak in 1953 at an industry banquet. Both men were seated at the same table. By mistake, some said, by design, others claimed. The air was thick with tension. A guest joked about the 2 greatest cowboys in the room. Wayne raised his glass and said, "Only one of us ever drew in a real fight." Scott stood up, and only one of us ever had the courage to fight one. Witnesses described a moment of silence, and then chaos. The 2 men nearly came to blows before security separated them. From that night forward, they never spoke again. The rest of the decade turned into a Cold War fought on film reels. When Wayne released The Searchers, Scott answered with 7 Men from Now, a smaller film, but critics hailed it as a masterpiece. When Wayne produced The Alamo, Scott turned down offers for political westerns entirely, saying he wouldn't make propaganda dressed as patriotism. The audience didn't know, but their rivalry shaped the very tone of American Western cinema. In a sense, Wayne represented America's arrogance, loud, self-assured, convinced of its own righteousness. Scott represented its conscience, quiet, moral, aware of the cost of violence. They never needed to speak again. Their films were their arguments. By the 1960s, both men were aging legends. The Western genre that made them famous was beginning to die. Wayne grew more political, endorsing conservative causes and surrounding himself with yes-men. Scott withdrew almost completely from the public eye, retiring after Ride the High Country in 1962, a film that many consider a quiet farewell to the Old West itself. Ironically, Ride the High Country told the story of 2 aging gunfighters, one corrupt, one noble, facing the end of their time. When asked about it years later, Scott said softly, "Every story has 2 men riding the same trail. One loses himself, the other finds peace." Many thought he was talking about John Wayne. Randolph Scott lived to be 89. In his final years, he rarely granted interviews. But according to one account from a family friend, not long before his death, he was asked if he had ever made peace with Wayne. Scott's reply was quiet but firm. He made peace with himself. That's enough for him. I don't need it. John Wayne, on the other hand, never publicly mentioned Scott again. But when he was dying of cancer in 1979, a journalist asked him who the greatest cowboy actor of all time was that he thought for a moment, smiled faintly, and said, "It wasn't me." That was all. In the years since, Hollywood historians have looked back on the Wayne-Scott feud not just as a clash of egos, but as a mirror of America itself. 2 men, both strong and proud, each convinced he was living by the right code, yet doomed to see the other as everything he despised. John Wayne became the face of the mythic cowboy, a hero larger than life. Randolph Scott became the heart of the Western, the quiet man who knew that real courage doesn't need applause. They never reconciled, but together they created the dual image of what the American West, and maybe America itself, has always been half swagger, half soul. And perhaps that's the real tragedy. Not that Randolph Scott hated John Wayne, but that 2 men who defined honor on screen could never find it with each other. In the end, their feud wasn't just personal. It was symbolic, the clash between 2 Americas, one brash and self-glorifying, the other dignified and introspective. Hollywood may have chosen its hero, but history remembers them both. Randolph Scott, the man of quiet principle, John Wayne, the legend of thunder and shadow. and between them, a silence that still echoes across the silver plains of memory.